of Florida now requires the unfunded mandate that every public school post our state motto in every building. Atheists of Florida to the rescue. We'll talk about that and more right now here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. You are about to enter the no superstition zone of rational thinking and intellectual curiosity here on the Atheist Forum. Standing by for your questions or comments at 727-441-3000, where you can talk to a real live atheist here on Tan Talk 1340. That's right, it's the voice of atheism in Florida. Our website, talk.aof.ngo, and you can install an atheist for only $2 right here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. We welcome your participation in the program at 441-3000. Jim Peterson, along with Joe Reinhardt and me, Ed Golly, and whoever else may step in and be part of it. To begin with, Joe, Melania Trump was going to campaign to eliminate cyberbullying as the nation's first lady. What kind of progress is she making?
Well, it's a good thing we have a one-hour program, Ed, because the answer to your question is none whatsoever.
No, wait a minute. She hasn't been cyberbullying at all.
That's right. As far as I know, she personally hasn't cyberbullied anyone.
There we are.
But
it always starts with number one.
There are articles plenty to the effect that Melania Trump's anti-bullying campaign has never gotten off the snide, and for the reason that, even as she has admitted, there's a certain conflict between the bullier-in-chief, the PG grabber himself, and so that makes it harder for her to carry out her campaign. But I do want to mention, while we're on the subject of melanomia, that a Twitter feud has broken out between Sean Hannity and Jimmy Kimmel. Jimmy Kimmel made a joke about Melania's accent, and Sean Hannity became morally outraged that he would pick on the First Lady, who is such a sweet lady, and I think she is a very sweet lady. The hypocrisy, of course, is that Sean Hannity, there's probably hours of tape footage of him blasting and slandering Michelle Obama, but that's perfectly okay because she was a Democrat, and I won't mention any other things that he might
and
not
she
have
had
liked
the temerity of starting a vegetable garden at the White House.
Oh, that's right. That's right. And trying to affect the diets of children, particularly, we know now, of course, that cheeseburger fanciers are much more the choice of the public. So, anyway, those of you who are interested should get online, check out HuffPo or YouTube and the Twitter feed between Sean Hannity and Jimmy Kimmel. Here's a spoiler alert, okay? Hannity has brought a knife to a gunfight.
Exactly. The state legislature here in Florida managed to slip into law and mandate that every school in the state, every public school, will post the state motto, which is "In God We Trust," in every building in the school, and it must be prominently displayed. There is no other specification as to the size of the type or, specifically where or what it's supposed to look like. But the important thing is they offered no funding for it because, as we know, they're continually trying to squeeze the public schools out of business and crush the teachers' union so that the education system in Florida will be privatized, aided and abetted. I don't really know what that word abet means, but it's commonly used by Betsy DeVos in the as Secretary of the Federal Education Department. But anyway, we are strong advocates of a good quality public education as mandated by our state's constitution, so we decided we'd jump in and see how we could help out. Mm-hmm. We have prepared an appropriate, I think, document that is usable to display in the public schools. It will satisfy the requirements, and a lot more. Actually, an educational piece that can be posted, and we're offering it to every school board in the entire state. All 67 counties can have them at our cost, including free shipping and postage. So
Amazing.
yes, and we're actually getting some traction on that, some response, because it really expresses the motto that the country used when it was established, which is the E pluribus unum. Probably didn't catch on too well because it's not English; it's Latin. Nobody knows what the heck it means, right?
Well, it means out of the strength of many, we are one people.
But the idea behind the "In God We Trust" mottos is to suggest that the government endorses religion. We all know exactly which religion it endorses, and so the state is using this law to try to convince students that it's the best aspect of citizenship to be a believer in the God. And there were even some other mottos in some other states that are similar. I think what was the one in Mississippi that
Tennessee passed the same law regarding "In God We Trust" in schools. The same
God
basically
enriches
the
or
same
something.
law.
God enriches.
Yes.
Yes, that was. I think that was New Mexico, actually.
Land of enchantment, land of entrapment.
they are.
Excuse me.
Yeah, the argument would be in defense of what they're doing is that it doesn't establish which particular God, but we all know what God is implied in our converted Pledge of Allegiance, which was converted to a Prayer of Allegiance. We all know it implies the Christian God.
And that's where I think the service that we're offering to perform to supply these mandated messages to every school is that our message will be, yes, in God we trust, but not necessarily the Abrahamic God. There are billions of gods, and we have a website at this very moment where you can go and vote as to which deity you would like to see included in our "In God We Trust" plaque. And so far, of course, we have Jehovah and Odin and Zeus and 3 or 4 Hindu gods.
There is a wide selection, but it's by no means inclusive. I mean, such a tremendous number of them. In fact, in Hinduism, the gods number in the billions.
Yeah.
And there are other religions that are similarly well equipped.
So you could have an individual God for each human running around. They can all have their own
Essentially,
private
yes.
God.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have that big a plaque. In fact, we don't even have that big a building because in order to meet this mandate, we're not going to need a plaque. We're going to need a mural.
Well, you get to choose your own. You see, that's the thing. It's a matter of choice.
But of course, the bottom line here, the point is that yes, there are numerous gods. Even today, there are gods that in the world that have more adherents than the Christian God, and it's certainly not the position of any government to, unless one lives in a theocracy, to tell the citizens what God to believe in, or even whether or not to believe in any gods or subscribe to any religions. And so, what we see by this act by our state legislature, really a spit in the face of the Constitution by saying we don't care that our country is founded as a secular nation, giving everybody the freedom to choose any religion or God they want to believe in or reject them all without affecting their status as citizens. We're going to start promoting this idea that it's a good thing to be a God believer.
But we're going to resist the temptation to point out that this is an affront to the Constitution and that pesky document that stands between them and theocracy. So
that's part of our main plaque. There is the inclusion of the words of the First Amendment that, to wit, the Congress shall make no law providing for
respecting an establishment of religion,
or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Right. And that's probably one of the most important things that any government has ever done. In providing for the religious freedom of the individual, not the churches, but the individual person gets to decide what, if any, sort of religion or gods they wish to advocate for.
So if the state really, or the legislatures, I should say, the legislators abide by the Constitution, they would never do anything like this. They would leave all references to gods and any kind of religion completely out of the public schools that are supposed to be secular. They are not there to indoctrinate anybody into any God idea.
The question arises: are people who propose such things advocating that the government endorses God, or that God endorses the government? Either way, it's not good.
Quite right.
Well, again, Christians are required by their deity to spread the good news to every soul on the planet Earth. It's called the Great Commission, the last chapter of Mark. And I don't want to speculate on the thoughts of the Almighty, because he, it, or they work in such mysterious ways. But if in fact they are omniscient, they had to know that it's difficult to get two people to agree on the subject of religion, let alone 7 billion. And the requirement that everyone come to the same opinion as to which supernatural being happened to be running the universe du jour, the idea of that ever happening was so remote, and the certainty of the conflict and the torture and the abuses and the endless suffering and war, and I could go on and on. The blame for that has to fall on someone or something who knew it would occur. The idea that we all ought to be of one faith is just about the most heinous, ridiculous idea on this planet. And the idea that you should be tortured forever if you don't happen to agree with me on this subject is right up there with it.
Well, now, do other religions have this kind of proselytizing spirit?
Are you kidding?
Some of them do, not all.
Okay.
Well, that's the fear-mongering being generated by our president these days, right? That we can't let Muslims come in the country because they're all going to be walking around the street with AR-15 shooting people at random. We got to keep them out. Well, they're all terrorists. And we're told that that's one of the tenets of their religion is intolerance for any rejection of the religion.
Well, we're told that because it's written in their holy book.
And it's the same thing in the Christian Bible.
Right. The only difference is we ignore it, and
exactly.
They are far less of the cafeteria-style believers as we are.
Right.
They tend to actually live up to their faith.
In some of the more cosmopolitan areas of the Middle East, and in some of the Muslim countries, or in places where Muslims are the minority, they're a little bit more tolerant. Basically because they have to be, but also it may be that the cosmopolitan aspect of a changing world is beginning to have some sort of impact, and that we can only applaud and hope we see a further development along those lines.
They're
but
evolving
still,
like everything else.
That's right. Can't stop it.
Yep.
But it's unfortunate that the protagonists of religion feel the necessity of trying to make everyone else agree with them.
Yeah, and nobody will kill you over what brand of gasoline you buy, okay?
Well,
but they will damn sure kill you over what kind of holy book you carry or don't carry.
441-3000 if you'd like to join the conversation and think that maybe this was a good idea by the legislature. I think, Joe, that it goes hand in hand with this underlying movement that keeps creeping along to essentially dumb down the entire public school system in this state, other states following suit, and hand the entire public education system over almost exclusively to the churches to be privatized, with the voucher system paying for it, so that that essentially religion will control the education, which, and of course, religious schools aren't education, they're indoctrination.
You can just see the conservatives foaming at the mouth
every day
over the idea of privatizing the schools. And it's not just because now we can put all the religious proselytizing back in the schools that we had decades ago, back when America was really great. But there's money involved. You know, there's
yes.
Every backpack is full of cash. The government is given so much per student. The states give you so much per student. So there's a huge amount of money involved. You can control whether or not you're going to have thugs or bullies in your school, or throw them out if they don't speak the language.
Don't worry, Melania has that under control.
If you don't want to teach sex education, you don't have to do that. And so the list of benefits to the collapse, I forgot about teachers' unions, the list of benefits to the collapse of the school system, I think, is probably second only to the collapse of the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. And this kind of corruption is further complicated by the fact that it is based largely on appeals to understated racism. In other words, getting white students out of the public schools, leaving the public schools as bastions for black kids.
The catch-all for all of the undesirable.
Well, you know, don't you think a bully is a
the
dog whistle for black?
Yeah, it's more than a dog whistle. It's a foghorn. I mean, it's kind of outrageous.
Siren.
Actually.
Sure, because you can't segregate the public schools anymore.
That's right.
I mean, they were.
Then you have to ask. You have to ask, what kind of a people are we that we allow these things to occur? But go ahead, Ed.
No, we're fearful people. We're people
We are.
that still want to be segregated in this country, and I think that's part of the reason for it. I think the money is the other part, that it allows corporations to come in and get their hands on these enormous state budgets and federal budgets that are spent on schools. So when it's privatized, it can be used to pay enormous salaries to CEOs, and then that can feed back into the political coffers of the politicians who steer us toward this direction with little regard to the quality of education. I think also, I might be stepping out a little bit here, but dumbing down the population seems to be the way to keep conservatives in power. This might strike a raw nerve, but I mean, you look at the states that are traditionally the reliable red states, the flyover states. They're the states with the lowest standards of education, highest rates of teen pregnancy, highest rates of poverty, food stamps, government assistance, unemployment, and
getting money from the blue states.
they all voted for, well, not all of them, but, well, yeah, all of those states were Trump states. Those are conservative states who are willing to reject the basic principles of the conservative platform just to get this guy in power. Because as we all know, the first step to being a conservative is to master the art of
hypocrisy.
Yes.
Hypocrites. Yes.
Hypocrisy. Yeah, right.
But
hypocrisy. Hypocrisy.
But I think that's a good point, though, especially about the dumbing down. One of the great faults of the private schools is that they're not subject to the same kinds of testing that the public schools are, and consequently their students are less well educated and less capable often, not always of course, but often, and their education, because it's dominated often by religious interests, they don't have as much understanding and in-depth education on history, science, art, and a good many other things that help to humanize us.
And of course, the teacher standards are lowered. They essentially can have none, other than you can show up and read the curricula. Whereas the public school teachers need to have degrees in education in order to get a job, even in the elementary schools. But in a private school, the guy that's chopping the hedges can come in and be hired to teach algebra. They don't really care. But what's that going to do to the competitiveness of this nation on the world stage if we start dumbing down our student population? You know, that's going to be a very, very expensive price to pay for the next generation.
We have always led the world, at least since World War II, in research and development. American clothing, American movies, American music have been the envy of the world. That's beginning to change.
I think, too, another concern would be the amount of corruption and financial mismanagement that would take place. My guess is the conservatives really wouldn't care very much about that. had an example just last month of an Ohio businessman who was accused of selling marked up goods and fraudulently billing Florida charter schools, 5 of which were in Hillsborough and Pinellas counties, found guilty last month for jacking up prices as much as 300% to sell to charter schools managed by a private company. So once this public money gets out there and is up for grabs, they're going to grab all they can. Now, Jim, the definition of a charter school, this is curious to me. It's a public school that's operated privately. It's created, supported, and continually expanded by the Florida legislature, their stated purpose to find innovative new ways to educate children. But, as we've just explained, they also are less closely regulated and less exposed to state accountability measures than the traditional public schools have. So
I don't think I'd really be wild about the idea of using my child in an experiment.
Especially since the public schools have worked so well for all these years.
I think the Adams family had something to do with that. But anyway, that's that's a big problem. One of the aspects of it that we're seeing right now is the fact that public school teachers are on strike in about 3 different, maybe 4 different states for a decent living wage. And that is another way of dumbing down the educational system, because more competent people will go to other careers. Less competent people will make do with what they could get from teaching. But the extraordinary thing is that we still have so many competent people still trying to teach students because they love the job and they love interacting with the students. And
perhaps you saw that teacher who posted her pay stub online.
Yes,
$331 a week.
Yeah, I did see that.
About $16,000 a year.
Yes, ridiculous.
To teach your children, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they got to have second jobs and even third jobs.
Yeah, and then they got to supply half of the school supplies
That's right.
Themselves.
Well, is this the measure of a great nation? It's easy to beat our breast and pronounce we're the greatest nation in the world.
We got $1 trillion that we can throw at the military every year,
yes.
Which again raises the question of what exactly are we defending if we don't have any left over to at least feed, educate, and house our citizens?
We are the richest nation in the world. We have the most billionaires and the richest billionaires and trillionaires even at this point. So I think that's what we're boasting about, is the fact that we have so many of these hyper rich people. What we don't have, however, is the dispersion of all this enormous wealth into building up the human capital of our country. Things like not just education, but medical care and decent housing and cultural opportunities and all kinds of ways in which we can live better lives. And we're just ignoring it all because we're driven out of fear.
Ways
to go out
in
there
which all of us can live better lives.
That's right.
Not just a few of us.
And isn't that exactly what the Trump tax revision did, was to steer more wealth into the hands of fewer people, leaving less for the government to provide the services that it's obligated to provide for us and collects tax revenues for.
Well, I don't think that greedy scum such as yourself should be so ungrateful about the $20 a week that you're going to get back in tax savings.
I mean, I spend every penny.
That's right. Think about what you can buy for $20 a week.
More fuel, maybe. Well, President Donald Trump
to throw at
has frequently declared the free press to be the enemy of the people. The last national leader to make that proclamation was Joseph Stalin, and it was rejected by Nikita Khrushchev when he replaced Stalin as the head of the Soviet Union. We're going to take a short break, tell you a little bit about Atheists of Florida, and when we come back, we're going to delve into that right here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. Atheists of Florida is a nonprofit membership organization founded in 1992. For over 25 years, Atheists of Florida has brought atheists together to address state-church separation issues,
provide legal assistance in cases of religious discrimination in employment or educational institutions, help atheists meet others who want to live their lives free of religion, and produce the Atheist Forum. For membership information, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com, where you'll find our newsletters, annual reports, statement of purpose, and information about meetings and events. That's atheistofflorida.com.
Voice of Atheism in Florida. And don't forget, you can insult an atheist for only $2 at 441-3000. Follow our program on our website, talk.aof.ngo. Joe, let's talk some quotes here.
Well, Ed, I had a quote from Stephen Hawking, which I am going to read in just a second. But while we're on the subject of schools and educational systems and what we ought to be teaching in our schools, I do have a quote here which says, "Secular schools can never be tolerated because such schools have no religious instruction." The idea being that every school must have religion. It's not just required out of fiat, it's required because it's so beneficial. It was Adolf Hitler that said that in April 26, 1933. And it's as true now as it was then. Our quote that we had planned for this evening is from Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking, and I like this quote for its getting right to the point, which is, "The scientific account is complete. Theology is unnecessary." Thank you, Stephen. End of argument.
As far as he's concerned. Go ahead, Jim.
All right, so in this segment of our broadcast, we'll be talking about news and Trump's views on the news. The question is, who is the enemy of the people? The results of several recent polls show that almost a third, 27 to 38% of Americans, support Donald Trump's stated belief that the media is, quote, an enemy of the American people, and favor government restrictions on the press, according to a new survey. Now, that is, the people surveyed favored and Trump does too, I'm sure. But attacks on the press became a regular feature of Mr. Trump's presidential campaign, during which he frequently denounced the media and encouraged supporters to jeer reporters at rallies. He has continued to deride unfavorable coverage as fake news and attack the news organizations that report it. This is in stark contrast to the behavior of his predecessors, many of whom actually hated the unfavorable coverage they sometimes received, but all of them, at least publicly, acknowledged and supported the vital and constitutionally protected role of the press in a democratic society. Assailing the press helped fuel Trump's presidential campaign, during which he frequently denounced the media and encouraged supporters to jeer reporters at rallies. He has continued to deride unfavorable coverage as fake news and criticize news organizations that report it. Despite the embrace of Mr. Trump's anti-press rhetoric, overall views of the media have actually improved. The survey found that just under half of Americans have either a great deal of confidence or a fair amount of confidence in the media, an increase over recent levels. But that support fractured along political lines, with an overwhelming majority of liberals, about 74%, trusting the media, as against just 19% of conservatives with the same sentiment. That means that about 81% of conservatives do not trust the media. So that's a major problem. That split has grown since Mr. Trump's election, needless to say. All this is not to say that the press gets off with a free ride. In too many cases, the administration's policies have gone without critical analysis they deserve. Much of this weakness is structural. Print media of all kinds has greatly contracted, as circulations have plummeted to all-time lows, along with advertiser support. This in turn is attributable to lower levels of practical literacy associated with the rise of multiple video alternatives. Oddly, it is students who have taken on the cognitive tasks once reserved for their elders. The recent student demonstrations have brought forth ample evidence of unexpectedly high levels of rhetorical brilliance. Perhaps they are the ones we've been waiting for. Have you been impressed with what you've seen with several of the students who came up and testified before Congress? And I was just greatly heartened by what they had to say and the manner in which they said it.
And the fact that they haven't even graduated from high school yet.
That's right. That's encouraging.
Ask Laura Ingraham how it's going with the students.
Yeah. It really is, though, something I just never imagined I'd see, because we have always been taught that this free press concept was what was so great, and chastised the other dictator-run countries for having a state-run newspaper and no freedom to criticize them at all. And that's exactly now what our president seems to be telling us we need to lead towards, so that the only news we get is from one media outlet and his tweets, and everything else is fake. This is unbelievable, because this is attacking the very foundation of a free society.
It's so patently obvious. Again, is one of the things that's frightening about it. It's one thing to be critical or to defend what you've said or done, but it is, if you had to make a list of what would you do if you wanted to permanently take over a society, to make for a dictatorship or to overthrow a democracy?
That's step one.
The first thing you would want is control of the armed forces.
Oh, yeah.
Well, they're currently the commander-in-chief of the armed forces is the most raving conservative that we've been treated to in quite a while. So that's a very significant and, again, terrifying first step. The second thing that ought to be or would be or is on the list is control the flow of information. Every dictatorship, every tyranny in the world has state television, state newspapers, state anything, and you can't so much as burp without them knowing about it and without their permission. Mm-hmm. That is just about as intolerable as it can get. And from there, it can only get more.
That kind of is consistent, too, with our criticism of religion. That's what religion always does. It says this one book has all the answers you need in life. And there's no reason to challenge it or question it or present an alternative view. And so as I look at conservatives, what I see their argument is that they want simple answers, even though life is proving to be a very complex institution to deal with, right? Mm-hmm. So everything is either good or evil, right or wrong.
Black or white.
Exactly. So when we dumb down the press that same way and say, well, the president is always right, he takes credit for everything good that happens and anything bad that happens he had nothing to do with, they're doing the exact same thing.
Right.
Well, the interesting thing here is that the question is whether or not Trump is a conservative. Because to be a conservative is to conserve the best that you find in your life. And for a politician, therefore, you would think that the thing they want to conserve is the Constitution and the guarantees of the First Amendment and so forth. And yet these people are not conservatives by that measure. They are radicals.
Fascists.
Well, some people say that. I think
fascism is the next
could well be true.
Step from conservatism.
But don't you think
it's a gateway idea?
A gateway idea.
Gateway politics.
That one of the main things that compels people to embrace conservatism is a fear of change, because change brings about something that's unknown. So it's not necessarily that it's a great idea. Like our healthcare system is a perfect example that I can think of, because we think, well, it's ours, so it's got to be the best, right? Everybody knows that everything America does is the best. It's the worst system of any of the industrialized nations, but why do the conservatives want to cling to it? They're afraid of change.
And why are they afraid? What are they afraid of?
You don't know what change is going to bring, so it could mean things are going to get unpleasant. Same thing with same-sex marriage, right? We all thought that if we let anybody marry the person of their choice, even if same sex, all hell would break loose, and the country would be swallowed up in the cesspool of immorality, and we'd all be a bunch of immoral lunatics running around. And it never happened. It became the law of the land. Nothing changed.
Well, I think people
except for those who were repressed by not being able to get married, and now they've been able to join the rest of the world in being able to have the freedom to live their lives to their perception of their best fulfillment.
We're liberated.
Yeah.
However, I think that you have to look at the fact that we're living in troubled times, in times that people are fearful of what they experienced when they were growing up as children, the world that they live in, and then Trump. For Trump personally, this is very true. He wants to go back to 1945 or so. He wants to go back to a time when there wasn't any EPA, their nasty regulations, and there wasn't the fact that black people were able to live as they wished and desired with the full protections of our Constitution and its government. This is not to say that this is a dream, as Martin Luther King spelled out, that has been achieved. Far from it. We still have a long way to go. But this is also a time when there's a distinct change in gender roles. Men and women are finding new ways in which to relate. And of course, all this taken together is very upsetting for a great many people.
Trump is the selfish result, I think, of a system that wants to bring back, for all you poli-sci majors, that wants to bring back laissez-faire, but wants to forget about noblesse oblige.
Yes. One balances the other. The noblesse oblige means the obligation of the nobility to look after the serfs,
the less fortunate,
and make sure that they were, in a good condition, so they could harvest the crops and make the nobles richer.
Fill up the trenches. Yeah.
Well, I think that's the inherent problem with Trump. He knows so little. He thinks he's got it all figured out, right? Because he doesn't have the attention span to read. Never read a book. He doesn't know what's going on. So when he starts these trade wars, he thinks it's the simple, easy solution. Start hitting Chinese imports with tariffs. It'll put Americans back to work. Now he's beginning to see, whoa, it's a lot more complicated than that, right?
Who knew health care could be so complicated?
Yeah.
And there's just one thing that's complicated.
Precisely. So I think this could really be a catastrophe for him if we see the stock market, really start taking a plunge this week. Now he still has a way out by saying that, no, we were just testing the waters, because that's what some of the spokespeople are saying, is that, well, he hasn't really done this yet, even though he said he's doing it. And we're tossing out some negotiable concepts here that we think China will respond to. But if they don't, and they start picking up the trade war, what does he do? Does he back down and show that he was wrong?
Well, I think the Chinese have responded, not favorably either.
Yeah. So he could find himself in a really tight spot of trying to, dance around this one if things start getting really difficult and primarily for a lot of the people that voted for him.
I haven't seen an analysis of the leverage that China enjoys because of how much of our credit they're holding, not to mention how much goods that we buy from them. So it's not just a trade war, it's a credit war as well.
I think the concept of a world economy is just lost on the guy, right? He's still back in the 50s era where the U.S. produced and sold everything to everybody else. I always wonder why we can't remember what it was like when we were importing large amounts of energy and oil, and think that, prior to that we were exporting it. Why didn't we save it back then and just drill enough for us and produce enough for us so that we could conserve this?
The reason for that was that we wanted to control world oil prices, and so we would dump oil on the market in order to keep prices and gasoline low, which made the automobile industry happy. It was called the Drain America First policy.
Wow.
It's not like
And
it
it
was
succeeded nicely, too.
It's not as if it was a big surprise to us.
Well, Trump's mind is a landscape of simpler times.
Yeah.
And he really yearns for that, as do so many of his followers. And in a way, you can't really blame them, because this is how they grew up, and they don't have the equipment necessary to deal with increasingly complex situations in the world. and the world is changing at a tremendous accelerated rate.
Yes.
The environmental crises, and there are many environmental crises involving food, involving climate, involving materials, all kinds of things that are creating all manner of difficulties across the globe.
Yeah, change used to be measured, from geological change in eons, but change among humans was basically measured in centuries, and now it's measured in news cycles.
Yes,
Yeah.
24-hour cycles, that's right.
Sure. Don't you think that's why he just claims it's all a hoax? It's the easiest way to deal with it. Pretend it isn't happening. Our governor has done the same thing. And that's why he put Pruitt in, because Pruitt is just as clueless about this stuff.
That is
And so
the
by
president, not the governor.
Yeah, it's just pulling. Pardon me.
The president put him in, not the governor.
Right,
But that's
I know
right.
that.
Yeah, I know you know that.
But he, but that way, by just pulling the covers over their heads and saying this isn't really happening, then there's no need to address it. They can start cutting the regulations for the profits of a few, and. Well, I hate to use the overused expression, but kick the can down the road. It's exactly what they're doing. Even if some of them do understand that it's happening, they still take that position that it's not going to affect us in our lifetime.
Yeah.
So let's make the most we can out of it.
What have
to
my
hell with
grandchildren
what.
done for me lately?
That's right.
And that can that they're kicking down the road is becoming really badly dented and diminished. So I don't know how long that'll go on.
Yeah, you're quite right. Joe, we talked. Incidentally, we heard Howard Simon the other day. He pointed out that the women's demonstration that took place the day following Trump's inauguration, not only in this country but in other Western European nations, was the largest political demonstration in the history of the world. And I keep wondering, why doesn't Trump take credit for that? Instead, he's saying
Well,
the
he
biggest
should. He was largely responsible for it.
I know. It's not a, you'd think at least he'd get a fact right if he could boast that, but he doesn't. Anyway, we'll find out.
Did you want to talk a little bit about the CRC while we're on the
I think
subject
we-
of Howard Simon?
Yes, I think we
The
should.
Constitutional Revision Commission?
I think it's a
For
committee or it's a
Florida.
commission. Doesn't matter, but it's the committee that is formed every 20 years to and empowered to put constitutional amendments in our state constitution.
Well, they're empowered to put it on
On the ballot.
on the ballot,
Yeah.
right, and then the people decide.
So we see that they're starting to combine a lot of these issues, which it seems to me that the Supreme Court of the state would need to automatically throw that out.
Yeah, because
But-
by law, any constitutional proposed amendment has to deal specifically and clearly focused on one subject and one subject only.
Yeah.
So they would automatically be disqualified unless they were really clever in combining them. And the commission has the list. Happily, the main issue that we were concerned with was and this affects the voucher issues as well, but it's Article 1, Section 3, or Section 1, Article 3 of the Florida Constitution. It's what's called the Blaine Amendment. And it states that no money may be given by the state to any church, religion, or sectarian organization, either directly or indirectly, ever. That's the Blaine Amendment. Now, I want to digress for just a minute. Although the Blaine Amendment, they did have a proposal to remove that from our Constitution. Happily, it will not be on the ballot in 2018. It was voted down. But I do want to give a little historical perspective on the Blaine Amendment.
Please do.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's only your permission I was waiting for.
I want to know.
There are 36 states that have what's called a Blaine Amendment in their constitution, which I just paraphrased for you a minute ago. Most of these passed right around the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th, and they were actually intended to prevent the public financing of Catholic churches, because Catholic churches Catholic religion had a vast number of private schools, and there were virtually very few Christian private schools at that time. So that's how they came about, although their effect and their usefulness is far more today than it was at the turn of the century. Blaine, by the way, was a Republican. He was nominated. He was a Republican presidential nominee, and his nomination speech was delivered by none other than Robert Greene Ingersoll. It's a famous speech. It's known today. If you want to look it up, it's called the Plumed Knight Speech, in which he nominates his great friend, I can't think of Blaine's first name, the senator from Maine, to run for the Republican president of the United States. So that's some history on the Blaine Amendment. It's been it's been with us for well over a century. It has stood us in good stead in well over 2/3 of the states, and it ought to stay there. Yeah, that's I think all I need to say on the Blaine
Interesting
Amendment.
how
We need it.
the objectives of the parties has reversed over the years, because when the Republican Party was founded, the focus was on the interest of the middle class and the people, and now it's reverted to focusing on the interest of corporate profits, dangling the illusion of religion and the expansion of religion into society to get the votes to do that. And we see that conservatives have absolutely no ethical foundation, because they put in as their standard bearer the most immoral, unethical person that we've seen on the political landscape easily in our lifetimes, possibly in the history of the country.
Well, as I said the other day in conversation with you, as far as the evangelicals are concerned and the religious right that supports Trump, and they went for him over 81% in the last election. My thoughts on that are that as long as he comes out strongly against abortion, and as long as he is willing to do everything he can to pack the Supreme Court and the federal court system with anti-abortion, hyper-conservative, Tea Party, right-wing nuts, they don't care if he kills somebody on Fifth Avenue. They don't care if he performs perverse sex acts with Michael Pence on public TV right at the halftime at the Super Bowl.
When is that scheduled for?
I tell you what, if he thought it would help his ratings, it would be this weekend.
Yeah.
But so much for
Super
the
Bowl.
idea that Trump's inspiration has anything to do with morality.
Abraham Lincoln would be spinning in his grave at such a rate. He'd be a major power supply for
I think
country.
you're right. And so anyway, so you say the Blaine Amendment is not under any threat in this time.
At
will
this
not be.
time, yes, that's correct.
But it really is being essentially ignored by the legislature, because not only by direct subsidy through vouchers, but indirect subsidy through tax.
Well, yeah, if you don't think
exemptions
not
for-
having to pay real estate taxes is not a transfer of money to the recipient of that deal, then I'd
Right.
sort of like to talk to you about my real estate taxes.
Do you have a bridge you'd like to sell?
Yeah, a bridge I'd like to sell, right.
But it's not unique to Florida. It's and it again, it is it's consistent with the fundamental principles of state-church
I don't
separation
know
in our
of any
federal
state that
constitution.
taxes religious property. I don't know of any
Right.
state that does that.
Oh. And I'm sure that's because when this whole concept of taxing started, towns had plenty of space to stick a church out somewhere and say, well, we're not going to tax them. And when property taxes started coming, I said, well, we can get around that. Until then, because there were no mega churches, just like
Yeah.
same thing with the Second Amendment. There were no AR-15s. They didn't have these highly
Well, it's
deadly
also
military
likely.
weapons available. So
And the
their
majority
laws were written
opinion was such that
accordingly,
nobody cared.
Plus, people had to go to the church.
Yeah,
Right? You
yeah.
were required to go, and a lot of most towns.
Well, it was
birth of
often
education.
specified by campaigning politicians that churches and religions were considered to be civilizing influences. So consequently, having a church in the town square was considered to be essential. But you can't blame people for having those thoughts, because you have to look at the religious traditions out of which they came. And the weight of that far exceeded the weight of the guarantee of religious independence in our First Amendment and Constitution.
Yeah. And so now established, it can be taken advantage of to a huge extent.
And has been.
Routinely is. And
$100 billion a year.
Yeah, and I see our state government just nudging us closer and closer to the complete privatization of the public schools and of the education system, I should say, in Florida. And well over 80% of those private and charter schools are going to be run by churches and religions.
The same people that we're paying for their churches and their schools and their religions scream like a stuck pig when Obama wanted to make them pay for their own insurance.
Stop sticking that pig.
Yeah. Well, we've got just a couple minutes left. Anything either of you like to bring up before we go?
Well, Shirley Joe has something to
Shirley Joe? Don't call me Shirley Joe. Just call me Shirley Jean. Yes, I do. I'd like to come out of the closet now that that's come up, but I'll save that for next week. And
I wondered what that echo was.
I would say, one other thing that
I did want to talk about Henry for a real parting shot, but go ahead.
The right to privacy in the Florida Constitution is something that's got the attention of the ACLU also, because some of these provisions or revisions to the Constitution that may be introduced by the CRC may begin to threaten these rights that we have held dear for so long. And so we really need to be alert to that and read very carefully between the lines whatever they want to put on the Constitution with respect to that. But anyway, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, I just want to mention in today's paper was a large article about the Reverend Henry Lyons.
Oh, indeed. I missed that.
Who has made a repeat performance.
Really? Okay.
You might recall that he went to jail for embezzling funds from the AME Church in St. Petersburg, and then he was the head of the Black Baptist Association and stole from them. Apparently, he's still carrying on a 20-year relationship with an ex-prostitute. I don't fault her for being an ex-prostitute. There's an old cliche, there's nobody more self-righteous than an ex-whore. I think I can use that word on the air.
Yeah, I remember that.
I saw it at 8 o'clock on TV last night, so it's okay.
It's in the dictionary.
On NBC, yeah. Nevertheless, Henry's still at it. A guy who has made his living for decades as a professional liar, telling tales that he knows nothing about and claiming to know things that he can't possibly know. And it's a big surprise to everybody that part of his professional lying career just has spilled over into professional thief as well. And I sincerely hope that Henry will
He's taken his congregations for a real ride. In fact, compared to lions, tigers and bears are no threat at all.
No threat at all. The lions do all the work.
Yeah. Jim, you have a gift. Why don't you consider returning it? I remember too the headlines. He got caught. He got in trouble right away when he went to the joint. They caught him trying to carve a bar of soap into a collection plate. You remember that? It didn't work. Well, anyway, that's about all the time we have for the Atheist Forum. Next week, we hope to have Howard Simon, the executive director of the ACLU, as our guest right here on the Atheist Forum to tell us a lot more about their concerns about the Constitution Revision Commission and where that can lead us all. So now, along with Joe Reinhardt and Jim Peterson, I'm Ed Golly, reminding you if the story seems a little too implausible to be true, don't believe it just because somebody wrote it down.
Make them prove it.
You have been listening to the Atheist Forum. To learn more about Atheists of Florida, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com. Continue the discussion on our website, talk.aof.ngo. Join us again next Sunday for another edition of the Atheist Forum here on Tan Talk 1340.